By the end of this year, y'all's quads are going to be ripped. The word for this morning is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. You may be seated. So I want to impress on you as we go through this epistle. This is our second week, so if you're visiting this morning and you want to jump in on really a truly rich book, a truly rich epistle, oftentimes it's, when you speak with Christians, James is one of their favorites. And it's probably because of the practical nature of James. James has more commands than any other New Testament book, and it's not that big of a book. It has over 100 imperatives, and James just cuts right to the chase. He gets right into what it means to be a Christian and how we should be living, and his primary concern is that of spiritual purity. Now, I said it last week, if you could put the book of James or the Epistle of James into 3 words, it would be spiritually pure. This is James' purpose, is to create a people that are spiritually pure. Now, let me help you understand what is meant by purity. Obviously, when we think about purity, we immediately think in terms of sexual connotations. Well, that is a part of it. That is one aspect of it, and yet purity in the mind of James and according to the holiness of God runs a lot deeper than that. It is about your entire life. It's about the way that you think. And so I want you to see the way that James would define spiritual purity. This is how he defines it in James chapter 4 and verse 8. He says, "Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts." So notice, purify your hearts, you double-minded. So the basis of being pure, what he says the reason for needing to be pure is that there is a double-mindedness that's happening presently. So this is a mind that's split in 2 different ways. This is a person that has not made up their mind. They are waffling between 2 worlds. And so when he says, purify your hearts, you double-minded, what we get from that is that purity in James is about being single-minded. Purity in James is about having a mind that is singularly fixed on Jesus Christ. We just read a moment ago, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. And he says, consider him in your struggle. Consider him, look to him, look at what Jesus did, but let your mind be singularly focused there. And so this is about making up our minds. This is about saying and recognizing, I can't have it both ways. I can't have Jesus and a firm grip on the world. It's one or the other. And so then you weigh the two and you say, which of these two is better? Well, Jesus is supremely better in every way. Jesus is the King of Kings, and I assure you, he is the greatest friend that you will ever have. He's done more for you than you can possibly begin to imagine. Jesus shed his blood for you at Calvary, and Paul says in the book of Romans that not only did he die, but that he lives for us. Jesus lives constantly in service to us. And so we can't have it both ways. James is getting at this. He's saying you can't have it both ways. And so this letter, and I think if you're just jumping in, join us on this journey. This is going to be about purifying our hearts and clearing away the kinds of dross that would make the metal and to make gold and silver to be impure. So join us as we do this. Now, I imagine, in a crowd of this size, I imagine that there are some, perhaps many, that are waffling between two worlds, that have a foot in the church and a foot in the world and are kind of counting the cost yet to decide. I imagine that there are some, perhaps many, that are on the edge of decision, some that have yet to fully believe in Jesus. Yes, perhaps there's an assent that maybe you've recognized. Yes, Jesus is the Christ. Maybe you assent to that idea. Jesus is the Christ. He's the King. And you believe that, and yet, do you believe what he's actually saying? Do you truly trust what he's calling you to do? When Jesus says a particular thing, do you believe that you should do it and that it's better for you to do it and that you must do it? This is what trust is about. I would imagine that there are some that are nominal Christians. Perhaps you can look back 20 years ago and you can say, where I'm standing today, I don't think I've progressed very far from where I was 20 years ago. And so the faith may be stagnant. Perhaps it's just a nominal thing. You wear the name of Christ, there are some boxes that are checked. And perhaps there are some that are in the throes of tribulation and trials and all kinds of tests. And there is a very real temptation to recoil in your faith because of those pressures. Or perhaps there's a very real temptation to doubt the goodness of God in the midst of these kinds of things. How can God permit me to endure this? I didn't deserve this. Where did it come from? I did nothing for this to happen to me, and yet here I am. And so there's a very real temptation to adopt this worldly mindset that would think that the duration of trials is somehow an indication of God not being good. I think that this is one legitimate possibility. And so I want for you to understand at the beginning of this lesson and at the beginning of this series is that God desires for you to be a whole, complete, pure, singularly focused person whose mind is stayed on Jesus, and who, irrespective of the environment that you're in, whether you're in this environment with people of the world or in this environment with people who confess Jesus, you behave the same. And you think the same kinds of ways. And if you're talking to this person over here, you don't go over here and speak of them in a way that's inconsistent with how you spoke to them when you were looking at them face to face. You don't, as James says, look at the perfect law and say, it's good. Man, that's really good. And it pointed out that you had some spinach between your teeth and there was an alfalfa on the back of your head, and you walked away and then you left it as it was. It's about being singularly focused and having a mind that is stayed on Jesus. That really is the purpose of this book. God wills for you to have the kind of peace of mind that I think one of the worst wars is when there's a war in your own mind. I've been here at times in my past, especially my late teens, early 20s, and there was a very real war. My mind was almost turned against itself. There were aspects of me, I knew these things to be true, and I so wanted these other things over here, and the conflict seemed to be existing constantly, where I, in my own mind, was being torn apart. James through the Holy Spirit through James wills for you to have a mind that is singularly focused, that is at peace, that trusts in God whether things are good or bad, that behaves consistently no matter your environment. That is what this letter is about. It's about spiritual purity, and there are many mechanisms God is going to use to bring about this goal, but James jumps right out the gate and he gives us one of the primary ones that God will use, and it is the endurance of trials. This is what God will do. So you're saying, how can I get from this being split between two worlds kind of way to being one that I'm 100% in, Jesus is everything for me. I'm not going to waffle any longer. The indecision is no longer a possibility. How do you get to there? James is going to say that it will be, God will use the endurance of trials. All kinds of trials, all kinds of difficulties, tribulations, pains, sufferings, all of these kinds of things. God will fashion the whole man through this. So I want you to see this in the text. I'll show you where I get that, and then I'm going to point out to you perhaps 3 reflections on this. So this is James chapter 1, verses 2 through 5. James says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you encounter trials of all kinds," which means it could be a health difficulty, it could be a financial difficulty, it could be a spiritual difficulty, it could be persecution, it could be it's any and all of them. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you encounter trials of all kinds, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. So something good comes out of this. And he says, but let endurance, and I just want you to see these words that he uses, let endurance have its complete work, or perfect work, or complete effect. The idea of completeness there is this idea of being whole and perfect. It's complete work so that you might be complete and whole, and he even goes so far as to say, lacking in nothing. So that's why I say this is the purpose of God. This is what he desires for you, is completeness, wholeness, spiritual purity, where you would be lacking truly in nothing. If you were lacking anything, he says, you would then go to God and you would ask God for it. If it was needed for you to be sanctified, if it's needed for you to be right on the day of the return of Jesus, it will be provided to you. So that's the text for this morning. Now, I want to give you 3 reflections about it. Number 1 is that endurance implies lasting discomfort. The word that he uses for endurance literally means, if you were to just take its Greek etymology, it's a compound word, but it means to remain under, or to remain underneath. And the idea is that there's some kind of pressure that is above you and that is pressing down on you, creating discomfort. And just by virtue of the word remain, to remain there, that's what it means. It means that is where you abide. The implication is this might be for a while. You might be there for a while. Maybe you are sitting here this morning and you have been there for a while. There has been some kind of pain or discomfort or trouble or tribulation, some trial manifested in some way that you've been dealing with, perhaps even for years. Well, that's what the word implies. That's just baked into it. So the first thing I want to say this morning is, do not lose faith over that, because this is part and parcel to the Christian faith. This is par for the course. This is just a part of it. This is the way that it is. There's nothing unusual about it. This is actually a normal thing. This idea of endurance is brought up continuously through the New Testament, and it implies lasting discomfort. Sometimes the enemy would like to use, you've been in this discomfort for so long a time, the enemy would like the conclusion to be, this must mean God isn't present. But if anything, it means God is present because the Bible speaks more to it being a reality than it not. The God we serve doesn't give false promises as a prosperity gospel might, saying, look, you come to me, you confess, I will make everything in your world perfect and good right away, so long as you give me enough of your money. It doesn't say that. God tells us up front, you can expect discomfort. You can expect trials. To me, that speaks to the legitimacy and the honesty of everything else that's said. There are no false promises. He tells us from the start. Now, look at what James says in James chapter 4. Just as a proof that this is normal, he says, take, for example, brothers, notice this, the suffering and the patience of the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Now, they're suffering, and by way of the word patient, what does that tell you about their suffering? This wasn't a sprint. If I'm going to go out onto my street, I'm doing 100-meter sprints, and I'm coming back to my house. I don't like the marathon thing. I want to do a sprint and then be done. Well, what does it imply when he says that the suffering requires patience? Sprint lasts 10 seconds. Patience is implying that this is drawn out. He says, take, for example, brothers, the suffering of the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So these are the people that represent Jesus. These are the people that stand for the things of Jesus. These are, for me and you today, this would be spokesmen for Jesus. These are people, and he says, look at them. Look at what happened. He said, behold, we consider those who endured. That's the same word as in chapter 1. We consider them blessed. He said, you have heard about the endurance of Job, and you have seen the outcome of the Lord, that the Lord is very sympathetic and merciful. So my point here is, look at those that have come before. What's that? Chapter 5? Oh, did I put chapter 4? That's chapter 5. God, you've seen the outcome. And this is no indication of God not being present. God's people have always endured this. So that's the first thing I want for you to see this morning, is that it implies lasting discomfort, and you can take courage knowing that's normal. So you're dealing with it right now. That is normal. That is par for the course. Number 2, hardships are productive, not meaningless. Let me say that again. Hardships are productive, not meaningless. This is the intention of God through them. This is where I'm getting this from. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you encounter trials of all kinds. And then he gives this participial phrase that basically explains how on earth could you be thinking of this in a positive light? How can I consider it pure joy? That doesn't make any sense. This goes against everything in my nature. But he says, consider it pure joy, knowing, this is the only basis on which you can consider this pure joy, is knowing that the testing of your faith does what? It produces endurance. Notice this, it is productive. That's why I said up here that it's productive. It's because it produces something. It actually does something. And look, if you meet a person who has absolutely zero endurance, you don't want them working for your company, do you? If you have a business and this person needs to sit down after 5 minutes, you don't want them working for your company. If you're a sports organization or you're not bringing somebody on that has no endurance and is only able to play for 5 minutes. There is really no field in which having no endurance is a good thing. We all recognize that endurance is a good thing. And so this is why trials and tribulations are a good thing, because they're productive in that they create people that are able to endure. The basic idea here is they're not meaningless. Your trials, your struggles, those things that you're enduring right now, they are not meaningless. In fact, when he talks about, in verse 1, when he talks about the testing of your faith, The idea there, the word that he uses for testing is the same word that's used for the kind of process that gold would undergo in a furnace, where the dross and the impurities are being removed from it so that only what is good may remain. That's the testing of your faith, and the outcome will be purity. The outcome will be the purity like that of gold that had gone through the furnace. The outcome will be someone who has endurance. You're not just going to give up the moment that things get difficult. So God intentionally uses these things to a good end, which I want you to know what this means right now. What this means, if endurance is required for eternal life, and it is, and trials brings about the thing required for eternal life, namely endurance, then you and I will be sitting in glory in some unknown amount of time, and we will be sitting there in glory giving thanks to God for the very things that grieved us most in this life. That's the kind of way we got to think about it. Now, I've told you the story before about my dad. I don't know if I told it on Sunday morning. It's just a good enough story to keep bringing up, so I will. My dad's best friend, Dave Van Gilder. I'm from Minnesota. Spent my whole life up there until graduated high school. So Dave Van Gilder was a child of the 60s and 70s in every way that you can imagine. Just everything you can imagine 60s and 70s, that was him. And so he'd contracted HIV, AIDS, through drug use, through sharing unclean needles with other persons. And he had, just a whole gamut of health issues that came along with that. Well, he came to Christ, and he renounced his former ways, and he gave those things up, and he walked with Jesus for a long time. Something came along, something deterred him, something steered him off course, where one day he just decided, I'm not doing this Christian thing anymore. I'm going back into the world. He didn't want to have a foot in and a foot out. I'm going back into the world. And so he went back into the world, and he went back to living his life as he'd lived it before. He worked up in Minneapolis. I lived in a little town called Owatonna, which is about an hour south of Minneapolis off of I-35. And one foggy January morning, and Minnesota winters are excruciatingly cold. When snow comes, it doesn't leave. And it was foggy. He was going down the highway full speed, and at about 75 miles an hour, emerging through the fog was a semi-truck parked in the middle of the highway as he hit a sheet of black ice and just slammed straight underneath that thing, ripped off the top of his car and snapped his neck immediately. Now, the result was paralysis immediately. Okay? Not a good thing. You'd look at that and you'd say, my gosh, what an awful thing that would happen to somebody. But I'll tell you this, on that having happened, the first person that he called was my dad, who had baptized him and who was his preacher, and he reached out and he said, I need you to come and pray with me. So my dad came and prayed, and they built a relationship together, and for the remainder of his life, which was about another 10 years, he ended up dying from some other things later on. For the remainder of his life, he lived faithfully to Jesus. We saw him on his deathbed, wanting nothing but Scripture, telling us to turn off the TV that had garbage flashing across it. He went into glory confessing Jesus Christ, and I assure you, and Dave would tell you, he would not have confessed Christ. He would not have returned to Christ had it not been for that thing that we would otherwise say was an awful thing to happen. I assure you now that he's secured in eternal glory that he's thanking God for allowing him to break his neck. Can we think that way? We ought to. Because this is precisely the point that James is making. Now, number 3. So the first point is that trials are implying lasting discomfort. That's normal. The second point was that hardships are productive, not meaningless. God might be doing something really good through this thing that you're enduring that would otherwise be really bad. But here's where I really need your attention for the next 15 minutes. The third point is that we have to let endurance do its complete work. Look at what he says in verse 4. This is James 1 and verse 4. Notice he says, but, so he says it brings about this. It does this. But then he says, but let endurance, this thing that results from trials, let endurance have its complete work. Let it have its complete work. Or its complete effect. Your version might say perfect work. It's this idea of wholeness, imperfections. Let it do that. I mean, this is an imperative to the church where he says, but you must let endurance do what endurance is trying to do. Let it have its complete work so that you might be complete and whole, lacking in nothing. When I read that, first of all, you recognize God is working, God is striving to accomplish something through this trial. God is trying to bring about this certain thing that the end result would be that I would have a singular focus on Him, that having gone through these troubling times, you kind of throw off baggage when things are hard, don't you? When you're going through hardships, when you're having to endure, you don't want extra weight. So in the midst of it, if you don't give up and you decide, glory is ahead of me, I'm still going to keep going, you drop off baggage along the way. This is kind of like the dross being melted away in the fire. You remove it, you don't want it anymore. So you recognize God has some purpose here. But when he says that God is working to do this, and then he says, let it do what it's trying to do, I look at that and I think, okay, so wait a minute. You're telling me that there's a possibility that this trial may not bring about the thing that God intends to be brought about through it. That's what James is saying. When he says, let it do what it's trying to do, the implication is it's possible to go through it and not come out with the advantage that God would have for you. So the question is this: what do you need to do to allow trials and endurance to complete its work? Another way of putting the question is, how should you be postured so that God can do in your life what He's trying to do, namely, bringing about a pure, perfect, whole, complete person? What do you need to do? And there's two things in the immediate context that James tells us, and then there's one that comes a little later in James that I'm just going to mention in passing as we close. But look at these. The first thing that you have to do is you have to consider your trials. You have to expressly think of your trials in a joyful manner. Now, this is what he says. He says, consider it pure joy when you encounter trials of all kinds. Consider it pure joy when you encounter trials of all kinds. And so when he says, let endurance do what it's trying to do, I mean, I think you've probably met some people that have endured some really hard things, and on the other end of those hard things, they're bitter people. That's possible. There are some persons that have gone through really hard things, and what came out on the other end was a cynic. What came out on the other end was an unbeliever. What came out on the other end was a person that was embittered toward God, embittered toward the church, embittered toward faith, perhaps thinking that there really is no meaning for any of these things. And so that's possible. You think about Israel that went into the wilderness. Did God have a purpose in not immediately taking this people that were idolaters and putting them into the promised land to build a temple for Him? Did God have a purpose in making them go through the wilderness, in making them cross the sea, in making them deal with the hot sun for that long? Yes, He did. The question is, how many people allowed the endurance to do what God intended to be done? Not very many. So you have to think right now in terms of pure joy. Now, that doesn't, we're not sadists. We don't think, man, I like the way this feels. And look, I'm pretty big into fitness. I actually do not like the way that it feels in the middle of the workout. Sometimes I've gotten finished with my workout and I thought, I'm never working out again for the rest of my life. The next day, I get up and do it again. I like the effect of it. I like what's produced through it. I do not like it in its own terms. It doesn't feel good on its own, but there is a sense in which you can say, it brings me joy to know the effect that will result from this. So he doesn't say consider it pure joy because trials are fun or because, we're especially fond of it. He's saying consider what it's going to do for you. And when you think about it in terms of pure joy, don't let it make you bitter. Think about what the result of it will be. When our baby girl was on a ventilator, we were in the room when her heart just stopped. She had a tension pneumothorax, and those that are in the medical field know exactly what that is, but her entire left lung in a moment just completely was flattened like a pancake. She only had a third of her right lung remaining. Now, the whole lung was there, but because of sickness within it, it was not functioning. And we're sitting there, and we see our baby girl, and this was an ordeal that lasted about a month, day after day, of everything you can imagine. And we're sitting there, and me and Miranda, we just drew together, and the thing we decided in the midst of this, we're not hardly sleeping, we're separate from our home, our baby is on the edge of her eternity. We do not know which way it's going. It's looking like it's not going to go the way that we would have it to go. And the thing that we had to do was we had to go to these kinds of scriptures to say, God uses these kinds of things to create the kind of people that he wants and the kind of people that are going to be able to be a help to other people who endure those things as well. We knew God has an eternal perspective in mind. God knows the end. I don't, but I know that he's good. He wouldn't make a bad end for a person that loves him. No matter what happens here, we're going to praise him because he's good no matter what it is that happens. So you have to think of your trials in this way. Whatever it is, you have to think God is doing something for me that I will one day thank him for. So listen to this. This is where I find my joy. Blessed is the man who endures the trial, because after being tested, he will receive the crown of life which was promised to those who love him. Do you want that crown of life? How good's that going to be? Do you want it? Do you know that God might bring it about for you through the very thing that grieves you the most right now? So consider it in pure joy. But we also need to have wisdom in the midst of it. Wisdom will not have its perfecting work if we don't have wisdom. I want you to see the way that these verses relate to one another. Let endurance have its complete effect so that you may be perfect, or so that you might be complete and whole. Look at this, lacking in nothing. And then notice immediately what verse 5 says. But if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask from God who gives to all. If there's a lack of wisdom, then the person isn't complete and whole, and the endurance didn't bring about what it was trying to bring about. And the idea here by him saying you need to have wisdom through it is that you have to have a right frame of mind within it. And I would say that this comes about, number one, we're going to look at this in a much deeper way next week, but by asking God simply to give this, asking God to give wisdom. But you can go into this book and you can read about the prophets and you can read about Job and you can see the long arc of history where we have the privilege of seeing the beginning and the end of many persons' lives. And we have the privilege of seeing the beginning and where all of the redemptive plan of God is going. We know who he is. We know how he works. You can go to these texts and you can gain wisdom in that kind of way. What he's saying is you need to have wisdom, or it won't do its perfect work. So for wisdom to have its complete work in you and endurance to do so, you have to go to God and ask for wisdom. And I would say that you do it like this. You say, Father, you're in a hardship right now. Maybe right this second you are. Father, give me perspective in this hour of trial. Give me an understanding of how I should advance through this. How would you have me act? How would you have me think? Illuminate for me the kind of attitude that I should have. Maybe you sense the beginnings of bitterness and doubt. God, let me see what you'd have me to see so that the bitterness would be driven away like dross, so that I could come through this on the other side as pure gold. Let my mind be stayed on you and not on the alluring messages of those who deny you, promising things better than what I have in Jesus Christ, which is a lie. Father, grant me wisdom in this dark hour. Grant me wisdom to see how you've used trials from the very beginning to create a people for your name, and help me see how you might be doing precisely that right now for me. Give me the kind of clear-headedness that could see the joy that is set before me. Jesus, it says in Hebrews, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. We cannot begin to imagine a trial as big as what Jesus went through at Calvary. Scourged. Imagine the ripping open of your back, the flaying of your skin, the piercing of your hands, the whole person hung on a cross being ridiculed before the world. The crown of thorns digging into his brow. Can you imagine it? For hours and hours and hours. The Hebrew writer says, look, he looks out at the church and he says, you have not yet endured to the point of shedding your blood. Jesus did endure to the point of not only shedding his blood, but being killed for it. So he says, consider him. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. So church, we need wisdom. We need wisdom to look ahead and see, where's this thing going? We have to know that God is at work. And the last thing I just want to mention briefly, I told you there were 3 actions. The first 2 are personal. I have to consider it in terms of joy. I have to have a wise frame of mind for endurance to do what it's going to do. The last thing is this. This is where the church comes in, because there are a lot of people right now in this church that are going through it. And have you ever considered that maybe the means of joy and the means of wisdom is not something that just miraculously appears out of nowhere, but that comes through the very people sitting next to that person on the pew? Have we considered this? There are many persons here, and this is what I've been talking about in terms of having a church that's a thick community. Church, every person here needs every person here. If you're brought into the body of Jesus Christ, you have a part to play without which the body's incomplete. And I'll say this, that part that you play is not just taking a station on a chair. It extends far beyond that. There are people here that are enduring things that maybe you can't imagine. Maybe you can. Maybe you've been through it and you have something that you could offer within it. Maybe just a shoulder to cry on, a hand to hold. I don't know what it is, but there are people here that need the people here. And it's a big enough place that you can't just have one person that goes and meets the needs of all the people. You need all the people. And so what I'm saying is, James says this. He says pure religion. You know, we sometimes say that, we just believe in Christianity. We believe in a relationship, not religion. That's false. Christianity is absolutely a religion. Taking the Lord's Supper, that's religious. That is religion. We'll talk about that more when this comes. But religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Notice this: in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So keeping yourself unstained from the world, just back out. What would that mean in terms of James? Spiritual purity. That means you have joy that's been produced through trials, and you have what? You have wisdom that has come through it, because otherwise you couldn't be pure in these kinds of terms. You're unstained from the world. So he's saying, take that. You've gone through the trial. You've seen the joy that comes through it. You've seen the endurance that comes through it. You've gained the wisdom that comes through it. Take that and then go visit those that are personally right now in affliction. This is a call for every single person in this room, not just those that are involved in special ministries. The people that you know that are in problems right now, go visit them and bring joy and bring wisdom and just bring your presence. God's going to use that. We need each other, church. This world's growing cold. We need thick communities. Can we draw together and link arms and show the world something better? I think that we absolutely can. So that's the call. God is using these trials for good, so let him bring about the good that he's trying to do it. Look with joy, look with wisdom, and God will bless us. If you have any need at all, if you need to come to Jesus and confess him, there's an opportunity to let that be known while we stand and while we sing.